Hey guys, what's going on? Quickly, just going to go over a kind of brief lecture with you, set up some background, and explain the assignments that you're doing. All right. So, let's get started. So, what we're going to be talking about are we're continuing our conversation on major texts, but also beginning to integrate some of the major teachings, right? When we read the kind of stories of Buddha's previous life, we learned some of the moral values of Buddhism. Now we're going to get into some more of the theocracy, the canon, if you will. All right. Things you'll need. So, before you get started, here's what I want you to have in front of you. There's a New York Times article. More on that in a minute. The things you want to start with first are the Teachings of Buddha handout, right? You'll find that one easy, the place where you take some notes and also do your note taking when you're doing your reading. There's a link to the first sermon of first sermon of Buddha, which is on Canvas for you. And then there's another handout about the New York Times article to help you take your notes and prepare for the assignment on it. In terms of what I'm asking you to do today for these assignments, I want you to do a quick write on the first sermons, more about that in a little bit, and then we're going to start an online discussion about this New York Times article. All right, so hopefully you can get all that on your screen. It might be a little bit cut off. If you want to pause to write everything down, you can, but I just want to summarize this as fast as I can. So the Sutra Pitaka is another text contained within the larger triptych, right? That is the three baskets text we talked about. It's been a couple weeks. I'm sure you hopefully remember. Um, and each basket contains something else of Buddha. And one of them happens to be one of the baskets is the basket of his teachings, his words, his, in theory, directly from his mouth. And so, even within that, there are tons of parts. And just as a little bit of history here, they were lectures delivered by Buddha, and then what happens is the followers begin to take his ideas and put them together. What is known as the First Council. We've talked about that before, and so these will vary a little bit by denomination. Each version of Buddhism is going to have a slightly different kind of like take on this stuff and different things, but for the most part, they're all kind of similar. All right, so there's all these different parts you see in front of you, right? Now, the parts that we have talked about, which got cut off, it looks a bit down here, is down. This part is a short collection where we read Jataka, which were those short stories about the previous lives of Buddha, and each one of them taught that kind of moral lesson. So obviously, we took some time with that one, right? And then up here is the one we're going to be reading from here, the Digha Nikaya, which again, I'm hoping I got that pronunciation right. What this is basically a series of 34 lectures. I think this literally translates to as long length or long ones, something along those lines. And anyway, these are going to be much longer, and they're going to cover the big, heavy topics of Buddhism. So, how to be mindful, which we'll talk about what that means later. How to live a contemplative life, right? That's certainly important. What death is, and all those things. So again, this is the longest one, and everything in it is going to have more depth to it, but it is kind of one that lays out the broad uh, theocratic ideas of Buddhism. Now, the other ones, just to kind of quickly go through the middle length, um, that's more of the idea that like if you're going to be start following the monastic life, aka be a monk, you should be familiar with this stuff. The kind of impression I get is that it's sort of like where you start if you wanted to be a monk, like how to be a Buddhist monk for dummies. I don't think that would be a very good title, but something along those lines, right? The one that I find most interesting is down here, the collection. It's also known as like the collection of numbers. So, maybe it's because my wife's a librarian, but the way they organize it is very strange. Instead of organizing it by like codifying it essentially by like topic, all right, they codify it by like length. So if Buddha talked about five things, he takes that goes in the collection of things where he talked about five things. Yeah, not really well organized, right? So I don't think this book is used with great frequency because it doesn't make it's probably hard to kind of work your way through. All right, so that's kind of just the book, the big, huge book that contains what we're about to look at. All right, so Buddha's first sermon. So if someone said to you, you need to understand the basics of Buddhism, right? What would be the one thing I should read? This would be it. All right. Um, just a little bit of background about, the story, because remember, we talked about this. Siddhartha was a person. Buddha was, Siddhartha, Buddha were people. And we talked about how do we separate that, historical figure from the legend? Well, here's what we have, right? Here's what we know, or at least what we think we know. So Siddhartha becomes Buddha. He achieves enlightenment. And now he begins to realize that his understanding of enlightenment and the path forward is such a gift to the world that he needs to share it with people. But then he also begins to realize that it's such a complicated process that it's very difficult to teach anybody. And instead of kind of just saying, well, I guess I can't do it, he decides it's too important. I have to share it with the world. The world needs to know what I believe and what I know. So then he'll go and find some old wise man, a traveling wise man, and say, I'm going to teach you what I've learned. He sits down, has the conversation, tells him everything he knows. And then evidently the old man like laughed at him and like walked away. And so at this moment, Siddhartha has to make the choice. Can he effectively educate? Right? Can he do and do this? Can he share his gift with the world, what he now knows? And so instead of kind of rolling over and saying, well, what's the point? He then decides to go to what is the deer park, right? And in the deer park, he will encounter five of his old friends from his aesthetic life. Remember, just to kind of recap here, an aesthetic is a person who lives this life void of like earthly pleasures and arguably even any form of anything pleasant, right? The legend was that Buddha was so good at being aesthetic, he could live off a single grain of rice. We're talking about that form of lifestyle. So he decides to sit down with five of his friends who are incredibly skeptical of what he's going to tell them. But through the course of his sermon, they begin to ask him questions and they begin to convert to his teaching. So, again, going back to the legend versus man thing, the story that we have is that these will become his first major followers, his first five, and then they will begin to help recruit and spread his word as well. Just so as you start reading this, so you are kind of prepared, it's set up as a dialogue. If any of you have ever read Plato, it reminds me a little bit of that in the sense that instead of it being someone just rambling or sharing their viewpoints, there is a bit of a back and forth. There are questions, but it is, in my mind, still very much set up to make Siddhartha slash Buddha look like a genius. And that's fine. Just like Plato did the same thing for Socrates and made him always look really good. Anyone who ever asked him a question, and Socrates would give a 2-page response, and the person would go, well, that's smart. You're so right. Kind of has that vibe. All right. So the first sermon assignment. So, like I said, this is going to contain a lot of the major principles of Buddhism, which is another way of saying the Dhamma, right? We might use canon, we might use ideology or some terms like that, but Dhamma would be the kind of these are the ideas, these are the practices. So the two big ones that come out are the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Now, you did your textbook reading, so you have some background. You know what some of the stuff is already, right? And when you read, you'll get a much deeper understanding of what he's talking about. So, the Four Noble Truths, I don't want to give you what they are. I want you to discover them and figure them out. But essentially, the way to summarize them is it's the knowledge one needs to be enlightened. If you know these four things, then you can become enlightened. All right, now you got to go and figure out what the four things are. All right, and then the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path are the practices a person must follow to achieve enlightenment. And so, over the course of the sermon, Siddhartha slash Buddha lays all of this out, right? And so, your job here is to read the sermon and begin to break it down. So, there's two things you should be doing as you're breaking it down. First is kind of the plot line, though that's not as important. I'll be honest with you. Like I said before, it's kind of this dialogue. There's not a ton of like action and things happening and movement and all that stuff. But again, it's worth kind of having, right? More importantly, what you want to do is you want to, as you're reading it, pull out the ideas, right? You want to, as you find the Four Noble Truths, make sure you list them out and what they talk about. The Eightfold Path is a little bit more complicated. And so, therefore, you're definitely going to want to be paying attention to that. Now, in the sermon, in the version that you have, it takes the Eightfold Path and breaks into 3 different areas. You want to make note of that. That's going to help you with your quick write. So after you've read all this, right, make sure you've got a good set of notes in front of you. You're then going to take a timed quick write with 2 questions. The first question is going to be about the Four Noble Truths, and the second question is going to be about the Eightfold Path. So I'll be honest with you, the one about the Eightfold Path has multiple parts to it, so make sure that you really have it down. Make sure you have your notes in front of you. Don't just read it once and then jump in there. That will not go well for you. But I've given you half an hour to complete the 2 questions. I think that's fair. I think it's plenty of time. for you to be able to do this. But to be clear, what I'm looking for in your responses are clear references, small, tiny quotes from the actual text. So, this isn't I'm not looking for just 2 or 3 sentences. I'm looking for kind of a, you know, well thought out, planned, and executed short writing. Again, that's kind of what the IB exam is eventually going to be. So, if you've completed that, let's talk about issues of modern Buddhism. Uh, so one of the things I really thought was fascinating and interesting is how we kind of looked at the challenges of anti-Semitism in the modern world. And I think that's actually a really cool, at least not that cool, but what I mean by what I think is interesting is to bring in kind of these religions are so old, they're dated with some people from so long ago. They just seem like such ingrained traditions. What are some of the issues that are happening in the modern world related to them? And so one of the ones I found I think is really interesting is um, there is a raging ethnic conflict between Buddhists and a small minority of Muslims in Myanmar or Burma, whatever how you want to pronounce it, or whichever one you want to use here. So here's what I'm asking you to do. I want you to read this New York Times article. All right. Again, I gave you something to help you break it down. So you'll have these kind of guiding questions to get the main ideas and the content, right? Um, but what you're going to do when you're done is you're going to participate in an online discussion slash message board where you're going to kind of outline or have a discussion about the article and how these events fit within the framework of Buddhism. I don't think I'm stepping on a line here, and I think you probably figured this out already. Buddhism is a religion based off of peace, yet there is this ethnic violence, uh, a genocide, as recognized by many international organizations, that is being led by Buddhists. It doesn't seem to jive. So, what we want to begin to do is have that conversation. It's like, okay, so first of all, why do these religious conflicts kind of happen? And we'll use this as an example, right? How does this fit within the framework of everything we've talked about? How does how do these people justify actions when you look at something like the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path? How does that work? And so I gave you very specific instructions about what you need to do when you post in terms of word length, in terms of how many times, things of that nature. So if you're using that reading guide properly, right, as you're reading, you're writing down observations or writing down questions. Your initial post could be observations, it can be a question. All right. You can pose questions to others in your second post. And I'm going to jump in there too to try to move things along. And don't be afraid to kind of take the conversation and extend it beyond just the 2 posts, right? My hope is that this might begin more of a dialogue than we've done in the past. I know we're kind of a quiet group, and I'm trying to find a way to kind of get more of that back and forth open conversation discussion on these things. Hopefully that makes sense. So if you have any questions, please reach out. And I guess I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.